The challenge for me when I was the Minister of Justice and the Attorney General was ensuring that we create the space for a transformation in the legal framework of the country. And this is and continues to be incredibly difficult work.
Tonight, we sit down with Jody Wilson-Raybould as she shares her take on the breakdown of the Indigenous rights framework. Good evening, welcome to APTN National News. I'm Dennis Ward. Jody Wilson-Raybould says Indigenous rights are no longer a priority for the Trudeau government. The former Justice Minister and Attorney General made the remarks Wednesday at a First Nations Provincial Justice Forum in BC, where she and fellow former Cabinet Minister Jane Philpott were celebrated for their handling of a controversy that has shaken the Liberal Party.
Remarkable, heroic, and inspiration. Just some of the ways Wilson-Raybould and Philpott were described in Musqueam Territory Wednesday.
Ultimately, the lifeblood of colonialism is written in the laws of this country.
But it wasn't all celebratory at the BC First Nations Justice Council's first annual summit.
With respect to Indigenous peoples, the failure to uphold the rule of law in the history of Canada has been one significant factor in the history of Crown Indigenous relations.
Wilson-Raybould detailed how a government that promised reconciliation pushed back against progressive measures like her civil litigation directive on Indigenous peoples.
There were some within the establishment who were fearful that shifting from the norm of how the courts had been used against Indigenous peoples would be a costly mistake.
She said there was also concern among her colleagues that recognizing and implementing Indigenous rights would come with economic risks.
Some who importantly did not, and perhaps still do not, realize that uncertainty, conflict, and unpredictability arise because the denial of rights, not because of their recognition.
While her stand against pressure to intervene in the SNC Lavalin case led to her ousting from the Liberal Party, Wilson-Raybould had unanimous support Wednesday in BC.
You've done a tremendous service to the Indigenous peoples of this country. You've set a very, very high standard, and you've inspired our people from coast to coast to coast.
Former cabinet member and ousted Liberal Jane Philpott was welcomed with the same fanfare.
We have two remarkable individuals. Minister Philpott, Honourable Jane Philpott, who has been the Minister of Health and the Minister of Indigenous Services recently, is well respected across this country by Indigenous peoples.
She said the SNC controversy revealed a serious clash of cultures in Ottawa.
And some have criticized me and Jody as being naive, as not understanding how things are done. Those critics failed to realize that the way things have always been done may not meet the standard of what Canadians expect from their political leaders.
While their time as Liberals has come to an end, both are considering running for another party in the fall election. Given their public commitment to Indigenous rights and a new way of doing politics, the bar is high for the party that may welcome them. Justin Brake, APTN National News, Vancouver.
Now, stay tuned later in the show. Justin Brake sits down with Jody Wilson-Raybould for an in-depth interview. Minister of Indigenous Services Seamus O'Regan was in Winnipeg this morning for the first time since taking over the role in January. He spoke about some investments to Jordan's Principle in the 2019 federal budget. The Trudeau government allocated $1.2 billion over 3 years to help First Nations children access health and social services. Jordan's Principle is named after Jordan River Anderson. Jordan spent years in the hospital while the province of Manitoba and the federal government argued over who should pay for his care at home. He died in the hospital at the age of 5.
First Nations children deserve the same opportunity to thrive as all other Canadian children. Jordan's Principle legally enshrines a moral obligation that was too often ignored. From July 2016 to March 31st, 2019, more than 218,000 requests were approved for products, services, and supports for First Nations children under Jordan's principle.
Still in Manitoba, the family of a teenager are upset and angry over the treatment a family member received while in the care of a youth detention center in Winnipeg. Today, they gathered at the Manitoba Youth Centre with signs to speak out about how their relatives' medical concerns were dismissed. Family members of the teenagers say the youth began complaining about pain in the beginning of March. By mid-March, the teen was transferred to a group home where the pain intensified. The family says on April 1st, the youth was taken to the Health Sciences Center emergency room and was admitted a few days later in critical condition. Father found out the condition of his child days after hospitalization, and he says he doesn't want this to happen to anyone else in care. The law prevents us from identifying the family.
I want to get them some people that are going to come listen to these youth, that are going to take them serious in these youth center, CFS, get some support system, some real support system.
Coming up after the break, our reporter Justin Brake sits down with former Attorney General Jody Wilson-Raybould. You won't want to miss that. But first, a look at what's coming up.
I'm Todd Lamoran, and here's what's coming up on Nation to Nation. The Senate Committee on Energy and the Environment continued its cross-Canada tour this week. It's studying proposed legislation that will change how major energy projects are assessed and approved. At a stop in Halifax, the committee heard from a Mi'kmaq chief who reminded it of what is critical when Indigenous communities are involved. As well, the producer of Nation to Nation has an update on a tragic failure of CFS, resulting in multiple lawsuits that are engulfing families hit by the deaths of children in care. That's coming up right after the national news.
Here's a look at Friday's weather forecast starting on the East Coast. 12 with showers for Halifax and Fredericton. +4 in Nain and Happy Valley Goose Bay where snow is on the way. Showers in 12 for Montreal and Quebec City. 10 in Saguenay. 11 with showers for Toronto and Windsor. 13 and rain for Ottawa. Rain, snow mix for Thunder Bay and a high of +8. 5 in Sioux Lookout. -1 with snow in Churchill. 6 in Norway House and God's Lake. 12 above under sunny skies for Winnipeg and Dauphin. 14 in Gimli. 11 for Saskatoon and Regina. Sunny and 10 above for Yorkton. 10 in Meadow Lake. 0 with snow for Stony Rapids. Welcome back. Following her speech at the BC First Nations Provincial Justice Forum on Wednesday, Jody Wilson-Raybould sat down with APTN News to talk about her efforts to strengthen Indigenous rights during her time as Justice Minister and Attorney General in the Trudeau government. Here is Justin Brake with part 1 of that interview.
So you just spoke at the First Nations Provincial Justice Forum here on unceded Musqueam territory, and you touched on the directive on civil litigation involving Indigenous peoples. You said there were some hurdles in bringing that to fruition. What challenges did you encounter?
Well, there were a number of challenges in bringing forward the directive to change and transform the way that the Government of Canada engages in litigation with Indigenous peoples. I think that generally change is difficult. Moving away from the status quo is difficult. But when I was Minister of Justice and the Attorney General under the government, we had made a commitment to move as much as we can cases out of the courts to try and find alternative ways of settling litigation that didn't necessarily mean going through the court system, which is inherently adversarial, but look for more appropriate ways to settle issues and challenges and build relationships with Indigenous peoples. So in the process of doing that, there were challenges in terms of working collaboratively with the bureaucracy, with getting input from other ministers, working within the Department of Justice, and working with what I would say are incredibly dedicated lawyers within the Department of Justice, and having, sometimes difficult conversations.
We know that last November you wanted to unveil that directive to chiefs here in BC towards the end of the month. The PMO asked you to hold off on that. Then you did issue it just 3 days before you were shuffled. Why did you do that? What the timing of it 3 days before, and did the PMO know about that, and did you have their approval?
Well, as I mentioned in my remarks today, the idea of the directive I expressed at an Assembly of First Nations meeting back in July of 2017, and the work had already started on the directive and the idea of issuing a directive around civil litigation. So that work was underway for almost 2 years and had been operationalized to a great degree within the Department of Justice when I was the minister. So when we moved forward into December and then in January when it was finally issued, it was because I felt and continue to feel very strongly that it sets and charts a different course in terms of our relationship, the Government of Canada's relationship with Indigenous people, a necessary but small change. And I wanted to make sure that that legacy, the work that the Department of Justice did when I was the minister, continues to carry on.
And did the PMO know that it was coming that day?
Well, I had worked collaboratively with, of course, within the Department of Justice, with my officials, with other ministers. The directive had the benefit of going to the cabinet table for discussions. So there were a number of ministers that have responsibilities around issues with respect to Indigenous peoples that had been involved, and that included officials in the Prime Minister's office.
I want to go back to your February 27th testimony for the House of Commons Justice Committee. You ended it by saying that you come from a long line of matriarchs and I am a truth teller in accordance with the laws and traditions of our big house. This is who I am and this is who I always will be. You've still not been permitted to share your entire story of recent events following the January cabinet shuffle. How do you negotiate these things, having a duty to truth on one side and then being silenced so publicly on the other hand?
I did have the opportunity, as you know, to present before the Justice Committee for many hours and also submit subsequent information by way of written evidence. And the evidence that I shared both orally and in writing was the experience that I had as the Attorney General throughout the course of those 4 months. That waiver was provided to me by the government in terms of what happened post my being the Attorney General. Of course, I uphold my confidences, including cabinet confidences, and the oaths that I took. In terms of what transpired or any discussions that happened after that, I have to respect the confidential nature of that information.
But you've indicated that there is more that you would like to say if you were able to speak more, that there's other important information.
Well, I was asked questions at the Justice Committee about further information that may be relevant after I ceased being the Attorney General, and I was responsive to some of those questions. And as I said in my written testimony, the relevant information with respect to the time when I was the Attorney General, I've had the opportunity to provide, and I believe the comprehensive nature of my oral testimony as well as the written evidence that I provided, Canadians can decide for themselves.
In numerous speeches last summer and last fall, particularly in the fall, you seemed to be showing a bit of frustration over government's progress on Indigenous rights. This is no secret anymore. After your shuffle, many people, many journalists pointed out that there were some comments in some of those speeches that may have indicated that something was awry. You ended one speech quoting Chief Joe Mathias, who said, "The turtle moves when he sticks out his neck." You said, "I say let us stick our necks out. I am." What did you mean by that exactly?
Well, I meant pretty much exactly what it says. If you want to move beyond the status quo, we're talking about Indigenous peoples and the relationship between and among Indigenous peoples and Crown governments. We have to stick our necks out. We have to take chances. The status quo is not working, and I feel that we have an obligation, not only as ministers at the time, but as Canadians, to ensure that we do everything we can to create the space, the necessary space, for Indigenous peoples to be self-determining, as expressed in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and to ensure that Indigenous peoples can finally see themselves in the mirror of the Constitution. That level of frustration maybe that existed in the speeches that I gave, or the lack of progress, or the nature in terms of the time it's taken to move towards what I believe needs to happen is a recognition of rights and implementation framework, was frustrating, or the pace of it, and I certainly would never seek to apologize about being anxious about change and creating the space for Indigenous peoples to rebuild their nations.
And speaking of the framework, we know now that there were problems with that. Michael Wernick testified that there were very serious policy differences between yourself and Carolyn Bennett. Very different views on a very significant thing, he said. What was that thing, and why did the framework break down from your perspective?
Well, not to speak to what Michael Wernick said in his testimony, but to the recognition and implementation of rights framework, the one that the Prime Minister spoke about in what I thought was an incredibly historic speech in the House of Commons on February the 14th, was and continues to be something that Indigenous peoples for generations have been pursuing, to have rights recognized, and on the basis of rights recognition have equal relationship with others, and to ensure that their inherent rights can be expressed. They can rebuild their nations however they determine that to be appropriate, and to move forward in terms of creating a better quality of life for their people, and in turn actually creating a better quality of life for Canadians. It's a big unanswered challenge and question that we have in Canada, and I am committed to now, of course, continuing the necessary work of creating that space.
Where did it fall apart exactly?
The challenge for me when I was the Minister of Justice and the Attorney General was ensuring that we create the space for a transformation in the legal framework of the country. And this is and continues to be incredibly difficult work, requires clarity of thought, requires an understanding of where we're seeking to go, and the framework that we're seeking to establish. And that's not to say we're starting from square one. We have had decades of Indigenous leadership that has advocated for rights recognition, for finding their place within the Canadian Federation. It was and is something that needs to continue to be focused on. Rights recognition, or how the government is continuing to move forward, is not dependent upon an agreement with the Crown. There are rights that Indigenous peoples have that are inherent. You can't actually give somebody their inherent rights, they just exist. The challenge that we have, and the challenge that we faced when I was the minister, is how we create the space to give expression to those rights. And it's not by purveying those rights on Indigenous peoples, it's by creating the space for Indigenous communities, peoples, and nations to rebuild based on their inherent rights, based on their own priorities and timing that their community dictates as appropriate, to be able to deconstruct their colonial legacy, to move away from the Indian Act in the case of First Nations, and to rebuild their nations based on their own priorities, draw down and exercise jurisdictions that they deem appropriate for their communities. But fundamental to that, and this is what I've always believed and what I've heard from Indigenous peoples not only in British Columbia but across the country, is to rebuild or to create the space to rebuild core institutions of government within Indigenous communities, which includes how Indigenous communities will elect their leaders, who their citizens are, what their constitution looks like. Those are all things that need to be determined by self-determining Indigenous peoples. That's what's expressed in Articles 4 and Articles 3 of the United Nations Declaration. And I believe, and I still believe, that it's fundamentally important for the federal government and the provincial governments to ensure that that space is created for Indigenous peoples when they're ready, willing, and able to move beyond their colonial reality to be self-determining, and that includes self-government.
An interesting interview for sure, and there's much more. You can tune in tomorrow for the second part of our interview with Jody Wilson-Raybould. Time for another quick break, and then the troubling findings in a report on the giant mine cleanup in Yellowknife.
Here's the rest of Friday's weather forecast, picking back up in northern Alberta. Sunny and 10 for Peace River. Sunny and +9 for Grand Prairie. 8 with showers in Medicine Hat. A rain-snow mix for Lethbridge and a high of 5. Sunny and 14 for Vancouver and Victoria. 15 under sunny skies in Campbell River. 11 for Fort Nelson. Rain-snow mix for Dease Lake and a high of +5. -1 in Old Crow, 7 above in Dawson, Beaver Creek, and Whitehorse. 6 with snow for Fort Liard and Trout Lake, -4 and snow in Yellowknife. 12 below for Sax Harbor, -9 for Inuvik and Colville Lake. 16 below in Chesterfield and Cambridge Bay, where snow is on the way. -13 for Arctic Bay, -15 in Igloo Lake.
Welcome back. The board overseeing the remediation of Giant Mine in Yellowknife has released its annual report with some troubling findings. The $1 billion price tag makes it one of the largest economic projects in the Northwest Territories. But since cleanup on the old gold mine started in 2016, it appears Northerners aren't getting many of the jobs. Close to $80 million has been spent in the last 2 years on care and maintenance work at the abandoned site. But according to the report, only 4% of those workers were Indigenous and 20% were Northerners. The Oversight Board says that a Northwest Territories government needs to offer training to local workers so they can get hired.
We think you got to look one step beyond that and say, well, what are the barriers to getting training? You know, so if there's not good childcare, if someone can't leave their job long enough to get the training that would get them a better job, you know, what are those barriers and how are you going to address that? So it's not enough to have a bunch of jobs available.
And that is your APTN National News for this Thursday. For the latest, visit our website, aptnnews.ca, and download the APTN News app. Thanks for tuning in. Stick around for Todd Lamarand and Nation to Nation. That's next. I'm Dennis Ward. Have a great night. We'll see you back here tomorrow.